The Occupy Wall Street was a movement that began on September 17, 2011, in Liberty Square in Manhattan's financial district. This movement was initiated by an article in the magazine Adbusters that was written by a man by the name of Michael White. White discussed how it was time that we all took a stand because he felt that we were the 99% and the rich were the 1%. His argument was that the rich are just getting richer and the poor are just getting poorer. Barker mentioned in his already occupied article, quote, rather than addressing the roots of inequality and settler colonialism, the 99% seeks to level the playing field within the imposed system of state and capital, end quote. The goals of Occupy Wall Street was to fight back against the corrosive power in major banks and multinational corporations over the democratic process and the role of Wall Street in creating an economic collapse that has caused the greatest recession in generations. Denise Ellis discussed in her Is Too Much Ever Enough article, quote, as such, Occupy Wall Street is the natural consequence and ordinary citizens being fed up with and alarmed at 1. Increasing social and economic disparities between the wealthiest individuals and the public. 2. Greed, unethical, and corrupt business practices that have led to economic instability. 3. Abuse of power. 4. An inordinate amount of influence on the government by the wealthiest. And 5. The unwillingness and or inability of the U.S. government to enforce laws and develop policies to control the excessive behavior, end quote. Protesters began standing in streets, in parks, and they would pick special holidays and call themselves occupying the area so that they had to be noticed. Shrivastava and Olga mentioned in their article, quote, the main idea expressed by the protesters' image was that governments ignored what ordinary people want and the role of government should be to protect the interests of its citizens and not the interests of big corporations, end quote. Occupying Wall Street was a method thought about that was to be different than other protests. Dean discussed the Enforcing Division article, quote, occupation as a tactic self-consciously misarranges these components in a specifically political form that opens up a new sense of collective power, end quote. This collective power that is mentioned is talking about the 99%. In order for the 99% to make a change so that the 1% will not be ruling the majority, the 99% must come together and try to make this change. Calhoun mentioned in the Occupy Wall Street in Perspective article, quote, participants in these protests made the point that the public should not be identified with the state but with the people, end quote. In addition to what Calhoun mentioned, Savio discusses in the Contemporary Justice Review, quote, in identifying and describing how the assemblies and occupation unintentionally served as mechanisms of coordination, I have shown that coordination can be the incidental or secondary result of collective action, end quote. Throughout the whole process, it took a turn for the worse. Police began using force to drive out the protesters from the streets. Jaffe explains in her article, quote, since the park occupations were driven out, by it should be noted some of the most frightening displays of excessive police force ever seen in this country, with hazmat suits and tear gas and rubber bullets and beatings and pepper spraying common. There has been an overwhelming tendency to point out what Occupy did wrong, end quote. This is where King would bring his theory into play. The protesters did not fight against the police. They just simply stood their grounds. They practiced the idea of civil disobedience. Instead of using violence to fight back against the police, they occupied the space. Akbaba explains in the Occupy the World article, quote, in sum, the Occupy movement characterized itself by new forms of communication, expression, and amplification strongly inspired by the previous mass demonstrations around the globe, end quote. As a result of the violence used by the police, the whole protest began losing its respect. I believe that Teachout said, quote, Occupy Wall Street was often associated with disorder, chaos, and lack of structure, end quote. This is where Deming would bring her theory to the table. Deming would argue that nonviolence has been attempted before, but it has not succeeded because it has not possessed the power and bravery that it needs. For Welty explains in her article, quote, nonviolence theorists argue that in order for a movement to succeed, its participants must be incredibly disciplined and able to practice nonviolent resistance in circumstances that can be both scary and disorienting. End quote. In conclusion, the movement was seen as a constructive failure because at the end of the day, we did not achieve the goal of overthrowing the idea of the 99% and the 1%. However, it did train up activists and it also launched new movements like Black Lives Matter.